Well, Ben, it's been a while.
It's been a while.
You and I have been traveling. You've been ministering. I've been vacationing, but it's been a while since we've been back together.
It's been a few weeks.
I'm glad to be back with Ben Rudolph. My name is Dan. We are the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship, and this is Life Talks. And today, this is our first episode since the end of the Supreme Court term that ended on basically June 30th, and they just all of a sudden, as they do, I don't know what it is, why they just like save them all up and then just dump them at the
I think
very end.
honestly it was because of last year's the emotional and the seismic decision of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. I think that they've tried to be like, let's just dump everything out at once. That's my assumption.
I mean, they have a history of waiting the big ones at the end. And, I've had some friends who worked in the Supreme Court who gave me theories on why it happens that way or their view on it. But anyway, certainly they did give us a bunch. So we're going to go over a few of these today and kind of give our pastoral perspective on some of the decisions, how they could implicate the church and believers and people who care about those kind of values, and just kind of chit-chat a little bit today.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, I know we're doing this because it affects a lot of people, the things that they've said and done. And one of the things I always try to think about when these Supreme Court decisions are made is, okay, how do we need to respond as the church? What are the implications tomorrow? What are the implications 5 years down the road? But at the end of the day, I do believe that no matter what the Supreme Court decides, we still are free to choose to obey God. Like these are not... We are, this whole idea of we're in the series in Galatians where we have this freedom in Christ. No matter what the government says or does, man, there is a level of freedom that we have that, these decisions really only affect us in the near term. We know that. Anyways, I just trying to put some perspective on these kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think the media hypes them a lot. If we have time toward the end, maybe we'll just talk about why the Supreme Court functions the way it does and why it should function the way it does. But the first one I wanted to chat with you a little bit about was a case that was out of Colorado. It was the official title was 303 Creative LLC versus Alinus. But this is basically a lady who is a believer who operated her own firm that designed websites.
Right.
And they asked her to design a website specifically for a same-sex wedding. And she says, no, that's against my beliefs, and declined to do it. Colorado has some rather aggressive laws protecting LGBTQ rights. They've had multiple cases before various courts, a couple of them to the Supreme Court, on what creates a conflict between a freedom of conscience. So the argument of the LGBT community is that if you are in business, discriminatory practices are not permitted against protected classes.
Correct.
And in Colorado and in the United States, in certain circumstances, the LGBTQs are considered a protected clause because of sexual orientation or preference. So she said, but I have a greater right, which is a First Amendment right, and she actually took this as a artistic freedom and a freedom of speech issue in addition to the fact that it was motivated by her religious. So it was kind of a multifaceted approach to this because it did violate her religious beliefs, but also she's an artist. She's producing art. These are creative acts that she uses to publicize things. And so the Supreme Court basically came down 6-3 that said, she was well within her rights to be able to decline that. And that is pretty consistent with where the courts have ended up in the last several decades, which is the idea that a private company has rights of proprietorship that allows them to discriminate under certain circumstances.
Right.
Now, a public company doesn't. A public company comes under a different set of laws and regulations, but she's a private purveyor. We don't have a constitutional right, for instance, to work for a public company and dictate what you will and will not do. You agree to work for them, and that's going to be whatever they assign to. But if you own the business and if you own the company. So for this particular court case, we feel on the religious right Christian perspective is if this was a great blow for freedom.
Yeah, I think this is probably the one that applies to Christians the most because in some ways we never want to feel forced to do something that is against our beliefs. And I think that I've heard a lot of discussion about this, especially from what I would say is more the progressive left, and they have said, you're basically you're allowing discrimination. Well, let's just make this really clear. What we're saying is, and what the justices are saying is, you cannot force someone to do something against their conscience and their will if it violates their religious freedom or their freedom of speech, which the Constitution protects. And so, to me, I think one of the things that I think there's a difference between there's been other cases like the baker. Remember the baker that wouldn't bake the cake?
Yeah, and that was the last big one out of Colorado.
So to me, there's a giant difference between a gay couple walking into a bakery and saying, "We want to buy some cupcakes." Okay? Okay, great. No one's going to stop them from buying cupcakes. No one's going to stop them from buying a cake, right? It's we're forcing you to use your creativity to produce something that your conscience violates, right? And so if a gay man or lesbian woman went up to this web designer and said, "I want you to design a website for my company," she would have no problem doing that. She's not discriminating against them because of their homosexuality, because she could perform lots of services with her website that could help them. What she's saying is, I'm not going to use my artistic license and expression to promote something I don't believe in. It would be the equivalent of, and I know many times you've heard this illustration, but it's the equivalent of someone from the KKK going to, someone who's African American and saying, "Hey, I want you," they own a print company, a print design company. "I want you to develop these flyers and website and brochures for our march and our conference." And they'd be like, "I'm not doing that," because it's violating the very essence of who they are, and it violates their free speech. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that I'm glad that the court sided with, the basic freedoms, that the very first freedom of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. So that to me is, I hate to say this, Dan, this feels like duh.
It would under most circumstances in previous generations, but political correctness and protection of the marginalized groups has become such a huge issue. But I would add to that. I'm a conservative, but I call myself a conservatarian. And one of the things is, I believe the free market sorts this out eventually.
Yeah.
And my view is, first of all, why would you want to do business with somebody who is offended by your very presence or offended by what you're requesting them to do?
Right.
Because I'm going to worry about the quality of the work then. And that's a very subjective thing.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be able to win those they didn't do a good job because I was, of this or nature. But if they tell you up front, "Look, I prefer not to do business with you because of my own beliefs," then go to the store. It's not like we don't have places. Or open your own store, open your own business. You may get wealthy doing that. And the consequence of that, by the way, is if you marginalize enough people, you'll go out of business.
Right.
So the free market eventually does take care of it. But in a libertarian culture, everybody gets to decide what they will and they won't do within, certain restrictions.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I kind of lean into my libertarian bent to some degree. I obviously jump off when it comes to things like abortion. But there was another similar case that I want to bring up too, because it had similar implications. And this was Groff versus DeJoy. And this was a case where a guy who worked for a company that delivered Amazon packages had made arrangements multiple times so they didn't have to work on Sunday. I believe this guy was an evangelical Christian, and the issue had always been they had accommodated, because he would say, "I'll work a double shift on Saturday," or "I will trade," because a lot of people, would want a Saturday off. He said, "I'll work your Saturday, or I'll work a holiday if you'll give me Sundays off." And it had been no problem for years and years. And then all of a sudden, new supervisor came in. He said, "No, you got to work Sundays." And he filed a religious discrimination. He had a track record. He had a pattern. He had established this wasn't just some buddy throwing a temper tantrum, just trying to get a weekend off. And so the court. This is interesting, and I think this ought to be reassuring. This decision was a 9-0 decision. Rarely in this court do we see unanimous decisions. But I think this is where we all understand that if we're going to have genuine freedom of religion in this country, you cannot compel somebody just out of an arbitrary rule to violate their practices of their faith. Now, again, I'm an evangelical Christian. I don't hold that narrow of a view that I would not work on a Sunday, but for this guy, he did.
Right.
And the court unanimously said, no, if accommodations are possible, then you need to accommodate them.
Right.
And so to me, that's a little bit reassuring that even the liberal justices on the court understand that at some point we have got to protect our religious freedoms.
You've got to protect religious freedom at some level. I mean, it should be a major priority, but we know from the LGBTQ issues that the liberal justices are going to side with that
because
religious,
they see them as a discriminated class,
right? Yeah. And to me, it's almost like one religion versus the other, in essence, because you have these two ideologies that keep clashing, and they've been clashing for the last 20 years in a public way and in the public square, but also through the through these various means, and all these court cases are coming up, and they're just going to keep coming, Dan. I mean, the reality is that movement, that ideology, is not going to slow down their ideology of trying to force people to accept, celebrate. You know what I mean? It's not going. This 6-3 decision. I'm hoping that this is the end for a while, but chances come. I mean, we're going to keep seeing these kinds of things happening.
Yeah, it may have delayed a future clash by a decade or so because they're not reticent to visit these repeatedly. And with a 6-3 majority, there's going to need to be two
massive shift in it,
two shifts, which could happen because you got Thomas who's aging, and any one of the others could get cancer or something. But for the time being, that was a positive one, and I think that it's interesting. There's a big move on the left to undermine the legitimacy of the court, claiming that it's controlled by radical right wing, which anybody 1 degree off of center anymore is considered a radical, particularly if you view them from the left. But this court does not consistently, it may consistently, but it does not always give us conservative victories, and there are multiple ones over the course of this term where they didn't. And the interesting thing is to see how their judicial philosophy plays out. And what we're seeing for the most part is a conservative majority who simply believes this: look, we go by the Constitution. The Constitution either lets us or doesn't let us. And we believe in the separation of powers. We're not going to speak to things that are not the court's decisions to make. That was the case in a third major court case that came up, and that was on whether President Biden had the authority to forgive a huge amount of student debt, hundreds of billions of dollars, up to $500 billion, just unilaterally say these
with a stroke of the pen.
With a stroke of the pen. And of course, if you look at the Constitution is very, very clear. The president does not have the right to spend money. He can spend money that's been allocated to him to spend by Congress, but the only institution of the 3 primary branches of government that get to spend the money
is Congress.
Authorize the money is the Congress. Now the others can spend it, but it has to be authorized. And so the question was, well, did Congress accidentally authorize this? And they pulled this, this regulative bill that decades old, that had gone back to one of the early Gulf Wars, and were using it to excuse this, and they were using justification of COVID, which has already been declared over. So, in other words, this was about politics. The president needs the vote of the Generation Z folks and the millennials, and those are the folks with all this excessive debt. And I'd like to talk about that in a whole episode at another time when we talk about going to college. But in the end, they voted that no, the president cannot just unilaterally dismiss this debt and place it back on the backs of the.
And to me, again, I think the first 2 decisions that we've talked about are very, they're more interest to us because they reflect how we think about our faith and how are there going to be limitations on our faith. And by God's grace, we have, we had some judicial victories. Again, that doesn't mean that we're out of the clear. It doesn't mean that in the future is bright in any means. It just means that, praise God, our rights are protected for at least another decade, like you said. But this is one of those things where this comes into more political philosophy than I would say religious philosophy. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, but it definitely has implications in decisions that are important to people of faith further on, because it does go to judicial philosophy.
Yeah. So how would you, as a Christian, how would you view what he? I mean, as a conservative, I'm thankful that this was one, because
it's
to me,
patently unfair to dismiss the debt of some and not others, and others who chose not to get into debt, which is one of the reasons I have a huge problem with the means testing of Social Security. I've prepared for retirement, and I'm going to get Social Security. They shouldn't take away my Social Security because I prepared for retirement. And they say, well, he's double dipping. No, it isn't. I didn't go to Disney World when other people did. I didn't take cruises when other people did. I didn't buy brand new cars. I prepared for my retirement. The fact that you didn't doesn't mean that now you should take away my Social Security because you failed to live with discipline. So the same thing comes with this case here. This case here was about some people choose not to go to college. Others choose to go into debt for degrees that will actually allow them to pay for the debt that they incurred, like medical degrees or law degrees. But other people have incurred hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt at a very young age, pursuing degrees that will not ever provide them with the income flow to service this amount of debt. Yet the government encourages it.
Yeah, and what we're saying is that's good. It's good that this decision came down, because otherwise other people are paying that bill.
Somebody's got to pay.
Someone's paying. It's not like it's just disappearing.
It doesn't disappear.
That money's going to be paid by someone, and if you just forgive this debt, it's going to be passed along by taxes in other ways to other people.
Yeah, and a tremendous amount of the money the government spends every year is not money that's come in from taxes. It's money that's been borrowed from China. Every year we become more and more indebted to China. At the point now we're at $31 trillion. In my lifetime, I remember when we hit $1 trillion. And so
I remember, I can't remember how long ago it was, but I remember going to New York City when I was in college, and you can climb and see that debt clock.
That clock, yeah.
And I'm trying to remember what it was. It might have been like $4 trillion. I'll have to go back and take a look when I was there. It was probably late 90s. But I remember thinking, oh my goodness, like we'll never. And I remember with Clinton, remember when the Republican majority took over the Congress in '94?
There's like 2 years.
All of a sudden, we started having surpluses in the budget, and we started having balanced budgets, and we're like, what is going on? And they actually said within a certain amount of years, we're going to be debt-free as a nation. And all of a sudden, that just disappeared. You know what I mean?
And then even the Republicans have joined in when 9/11 happened. It was just like, it will spend whatever it takes.
It was over.
But it's really interesting during that time, and it's something that we should note. The economy often lags the actions the government has taken by as much as a decade. And the surpluses were partly because of Congress, but they were largely because of some of the economic stimulus that came because of Reagan's policies. But you see, after Reagan, there was 4 years of Bush, and then there came. And so, almost a decade later, we started getting surpluses off the actions taken. That works in reverse as well. So if you spend frivolously, if you overtax, if you do these things, in 10 years, our economy is going to suffer even more than it is today.
That's right.
And we have to be aware of that, particularly in the area of inflation.
So I'm glad that they made this decision, just because I don't want to pay for someone else's college degree on, something that I don't believe in.
But also, nor do we want a president who can spend $500 billion unaccountably, because the next president, what's going to be his use of the money.
And I think all of us could see, and I can't remember, I read this one time, when the amount of executive orders that's been done per president, it just keeps multiplying over and over. So the executive branch is obviously gaining in power at a rapid pace, more than any other branch of the government. So.
And it's the role of the Supreme Court to keep that from happening. And that's really crucial.
Thank God we live in a nation where there are checks and balances.
And separation of powers. So the last one, real quickly, was the big case out of Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And this was the issue of how do you make decisions on whether a student can enroll in your school. And so for years, affirmative action had allowed schools to consider a student's race with the idea they wanted a diversified student population. Interestingly, this was not a case that was brought by white students, but rather Asian students. One of them was my friend, Kenny Zhu. Kenny worked out of the North Carolina, but he also spoke at Harvard about the situation.
And Kenny used to come to church
went
here.
to church here. He was in my Bible study. And he was a student at Davidson College here. And he's Chinese American. And so the issue that came up with him was he couldn't get into Harvard, even though his scores were higher than a lot of people that could, because he was Asian and they'd already met their quota of Harvard in students. And I don't know whether it was him or his brother, but he experienced it and continued to see it among his friends. So the idea was, should you be using race of any kind to decide who gets the privilege of a good education, whether it was at UNC, Chapel Hill, which is a state university, or Harvard, which is a private university. And in a 6-3 decision, they said no, you can't do that. Kinney's a big advocate of what he calls the meritocracy, and the meritocracy is that we should be completely colorblind and just use standards of merit. And I think he makes a very convincing case. He's written a book. He's got a new book coming out in August, and his name is Kinney Zhu, XU. I would urge you to get his books and read it. But this was a landmark case because, again, we have to understand what are the limits of a school's ability to discriminate. Can they say, well, if you're a conservative, you can't come, or if you're a Christian, or if you're a male, or if you're white or black or whatever.
Right.
And so again, it's equalizing the opportunity to go through. Now, I have African American friends who I love very much who were greatly distressed by this, and they say, well, you don't know what it's like to have been intentionally discriminated against for generations, and that's true. I don't, but I do believe this wasn't a black and white case. This was an Asian American case that was brought up, and in my opinion, it was a good decision, because I really believe if we're to get to Martin Luther King's dream of having a colorblind society, we have to quit making these decisions based on the color of one's skin.
I'm probably someone who's a little bit more, I've got a perplexing feelings on this. Yeah, I do believe that we should live in a meritocracy where it's what we should get what we've earned, basically. I also understand the history that of, like you said, that the decades long of oppression and racism that I believe have kept a lot of people from the opportunity to do these things. And so I do think that there was a time in which this idea was probably needed to help people that had no opportunity to do this. I do believe, though, we live in a nation now that, for the most part, I'm hoping that there's more opportunities than ever that people can take advantage of. I do think that, to be honest with you, Dan, I think these colleges and universities are just going to find another way to promote diversity. I don't think this is going to... They've already
stated that.
I don't think this is going to change much. That's basically what I'm...
They've already stated as such. And for that argument that's, that says there's still a disadvantage, I would say, okay, we've had a president. We have 2 Supreme Court justices. The mayors of 8 of the 10 largest cities in the country are African-American. You got to admit there's been a lot of progress made and opportunity made. And again, if I was an Asian student wanting to have my chance at these opportunities, I think I would have had some sympathy as well. Yeah. No chance of me ever getting into Harvard. So, that was that.
Me neither.
Well, that 21 minutes went quickly.
Flew by.
And actually went about 23 minutes. Yeah. But as always, thank you so much for listening to us here at Life Talks. Today was just a chat. All right. We want you to understand that. We're just sharing our opinions and talking around a water cooler like many of you do. But many of you have asked us these questions when you see us in a restaurant or at church or whatever. And so we thought we'd share today, but we hope you'll continue to listen to us here at Life Talks. Tell others about us, and you can always catch us wherever you catch your podcast. And until next time, thanks for joining us at Life Talks.